My name is Marcus Thorne, and 3 days ago, I became the most wanted man in 3 counties. Not because I robbed a bank, not because I hurt anyone, but because I opened a dam. One little lever, one moment of pure crystalline justice, and 35 McMansions that had no business being there. Well, let's just say they got a swimming pool they never asked for. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Every good story has a beginning. And mine starts 18 months ago. On the day I buried my father. Voice softens with pain, then hardens with resolve. The funeral was small. Dad didn't have many friends left. Most of them were already 6 feet under, or close to it. Just me, my sister Jenny, a handful of neighbors from the old days, and Reverend Patterson, who'd been giving the same eulogy with minor variations for 30 years. Benjamin Thorne was a man of the land, Patterson droned on, his voice echoing in the mostly empty chapel. A man who understood that some things are sacred, some things endure, sacred. That word would come back to haunt me after we lowered Dad into the ground next to Mom's grave. Jenny and I stood on the hill overlooking our family's property. 300 acres of Colorado. Wilderness that had been in the Thorne family for 4 generations. Rolling meadows, dense pine forests, and cutting right through the middle of it all, Bear Creek, fed by the small dam my great-grandfather had built in 1923. What are you going to do with all this? Jenny asked, gesturing toward the endless expanse of land. I kicked at a clump of dirt. Same thing Dad did. Same thing Grandpa did. Keep it wild. Keep it free. Jenny gave me that look. The one she'd been giving me since we were kids. The one that said I was being unrealistic. She was a lawyer now. Lived in Denver, drove a Tesla, and had opinions about maximizing asset potential. Marcus, you can't afford to keep this place. The property taxes alone are killing you. Dad was barely hanging on at the end. She was right, of course. Dad had been bleeding money for years, trying to maintain the property, pay the taxes, keep the dam in working order. His pension from the Forest Service wasn't enough, and pride had kept him from asking for help. There are developers sniffing around, Jenny continued. Good ones. Respectable ones. They'd pay top dollar for this land. No? The word came out harder than I intended. This land doesn't get developed. Period. Marcus. I said no, Jenny. Dad made me promise. On his deathbed, he made me promise this land would never be carved up and sold off to build another suburb full of people who don't belong here. Voice intensifies with memory. She left that afternoon, shaking her head and muttering about stubborn men and their stubborn principles. I stood alone on that hill, watching the sun set behind the mountains, listening to the creek babble its ancient song. I made my own promise that day. This land would stay wild no matter what it cost me. If only I'd known what that cost would be. Pause for dramatic effect. The first letter arrived 3 weeks later. Cream-colored paper, expensive letterhead. The kind that screams, "We have more money than you and better lawyers too." Pinnacle Development Corporation, specializing in premium mountain communities. Dear Mr. Thorne, we understand you recently inherited property at Bear Creek Valley. We represent several clients who are very interested in purchasing your land for development purposes. We believe we can offer you a price that would exceed your expectations. Please contact us at your earliest convenience to discuss this mutually beneficial opportunity. Sincerely, Richard Holbrook, Senior Partner. I fed the letter to the fireplace and forgot about it. But Pinnacle Development wasn't the type to take no for an answer. The letters kept coming, weekly at first, then twice a week. The offers got bigger, much bigger. 2.3 million for the whole property. 2.8 million. 3.5 million. That last number made me pause. $3.5 million. I could pay off Dad's debts, buy a small cabin somewhere else, maybe even have enough left over to live comfortably for the rest of my life. But every time I considered it, I'd walk down to the creek and listen to the water flowing over the rocks my great-grandfather had placed there by hand. I'd remember the stories Dad used to tell about the old days, when wolves still roamed these hills in the night, sky wasn't polluted by city lights. I'd remember my promise. The answer was still no. Voice becomes darker, more ominous. That's when things started getting creative. First, it was small stuff. My mailbox got knocked over by a drunk driver who was never caught. Someone left my gate open, and I spent 2 days tracking down my horses. The power company claimed there was an issue with my service and cut my electricity for a week in the middle of winter. I might be country, but I'm not stupid. I knew pressure tactics when I saw them. These developers had done this before. Worn down stubborn landowners until they gave up and sold. But they didn't know the Thorne family. We don't break easy. Then came the survey team. I was fixing fence posts on the eastern boundary when I heard the sound of engines. A convoy of white SUVs wound up the dirt road toward my property, kicking up clouds of dust. They parked right at my gate, didn't even have the courtesy to ask permission before tramping all over my land with their theodolites and measuring equipment. "Hey," I jogged over, waving my arms. "This is private property." The crew chief, a thin man in an expensive polo shirt, barely looked up from his clipboard. "We have a right to survey, Mr. Thorne. County Ordinance 847B, you can look it up. I don't care what ordinance you think you have. This is my land." He smiled. The kind of smile a snake gives a mouse. "Actually, Mr. Thorne, that's not entirely accurate." Voice builds with confusion and anger. What the hell did that mean? I found out the next day when I drove into town and paid a visit to the county courthouse. Mary Henderson, the clerk who'd been filing paperwork there since before I was born, looked uncomfortable when I asked to see my property records. "Marcus, honey, I think you might want to talk to a lawyer before." "Mary, just show me the papers." She sighed and pulled out a thick folder. As I flipped through the documents, my blood ran cold. Somehow, someway, a 2-acre parcel in the dead center of my property, the parcel that included the dam and the creek, was no longer listed as belonging to Benjamin Thorne or his estate. According to these records, that land had been returned to county ownership due to unpaid assessment liens 3 months ago. 3 months ago, while I was taking care of Dad in his final weeks, someone had been playing legal games with our property. "Mary, what the hell is an assessment lien?" She looked like she wanted to crawl under her desk. It's when the county levies charges for infrastructure improvements and the property owner doesn't pay. After a certain period, they can claim the land to satisfy the debt. What infrastructure improvements? There's nothing out there but trees and creek water. Well, she shuffled through more papers. It says here there were road improvements, utility easements, environmental impact studies. The total assessment was $47,000. $47,000 for improvements to land that had never seen a surveyor, never had utilities run to it, never needed a road improved because there was no road. Mary, I never got a bill for this. I never got any notice. It was sent to the property address, Marcus. Maybe your dad never got anything like that. He would have told me. But even as I said it, I wondered. Dad had been getting confused toward the end. Maybe he had gotten the notices and forgotten. Maybe he'd filed them somewhere and never mentioned them. Or maybe, voice drops to a dangerous whisper, maybe someone had made sure those notices never arrived at all. I drove home in a fury, my mind racing. 2 acres. They'd stolen 2 acres of my family's land through legal trickery. And not just any 2 acres. They'd taken the heart of the property. The dam, the creek, the spot where 4 generations of Thorns had fished and hunted, and taught their children to love the wilderness. But what could they possibly want with just 2 acres in the middle of nowhere? I found out 2 weeks later. Sound builds dramatically. I was awakened at dawn by the roar of heavy machinery. Bulldozers, excavators, a convoy of construction vehicles, rolling up the newly graded road that definitely hadn't been there the night before. I threw on clothes and ran outside, my heart pounding. The machines were heading straight for the creek, for the dam, for the 2 acres that were somehow no longer mine. Stop! I ran after them, waving my arms like a madman. You can't build there! The lead bulldozer ground to a halt, and a man in a hard hat climbed down from the cab. He was built like a linebacker, with arms like tree trunks and a face that suggested he'd settled most of his arguments with his fists. You Marcus Thorne? This is my property. You can't... He pulled a folded paper from his pocket and handed it to me. County development permit. We're building an access road and utility infrastructure. You got a problem with that? Take it up with the planning commission. The paper was official, all right. Signed and stamped by people I'd never heard of. Authorizing Phase 1 infrastructure. Development for Bear Creek Valley. Residential community. Bear Creek Valley Residential Community. They weren't just stealing my land. They were turning it into a subdivision. How many houses? My voice came out as a croak. The foreman grinned. 35 to start. Maybe more if the market responds well. Going to be real nice. $1 million homes with mountain views. Private lake access. Golf course down the valley. Private lake access? I looked toward the creek, toward the dam. What lake? The one we're going to make when we raise that old dam of yours about 20 feet. Create a nice little reservoir for the homeowners. Great for fishing, boating, swimming. Real estate gold, that water frontage. Voice shaking with rage. They were going to flood everything. The meadows where my grandfather had taught me to track deer. The grove of ancient aspens where Mom used to take me to collect wildflowers. The swimming hole where 4 generations of Thorne children had learned to dive. All of it underwater. You can't do this. Already doing it, friend. But hey, look on the bright side. Property values in the area are going to skyrocket. You'll be able to sell your remaining land for twice what it was worth before. That's when I lost it. I won't repeat exactly what I said to that foreman, but it involved several creative suggestions about what he could do with his development permit and where he could stick his property values. He just laughed and climbed back on his bulldozer. Have a nice day, neighbor. He called out as the machine rumbled toward the creek. Pa's voice becoming calculating. I spent the next 3 days in town, talking to lawyers, city planners, environmental groups, anyone who would listen. The story was always the same. Everything they were doing was perfectly legal. The county had followed proper procedures in claiming the land. The development permits were in order. Environmental impact had been assessed and approved. But they stole my land. I told anyone who would listen. They didn't steal it, said Janet Morrison, the lawyer Jenny had recommended. They followed established legal procedures to claim unpaid assessment liens. It happens more often than you'd think. I was never notified. The notices were sent to the property address on record. If they weren't received, that's unfortunate. But it doesn't invalidate the process. Unfortunate. 18 months later, I'd learned that Richard Holbrook, senior partner at Pinnacle Development, served on the County Planning Commission. I'd learned that his brother-in-law worked for the Postal Service and had a gambling problem. I'd learned that unfortunate was a funny way to describe a carefully orchestrated theft, but that was later. Right then, I was just a man watching bulldozers tear up his family's legacy. Voice becomes grim with determination. The construction moved fast, faster than seemed possible. Within a month, they had roads graded, power lines strung, and water mains buried. They'd built a temporary dam upstream to divert the creek while they worked on improving the original structure. I watched it all from my porch, powerless to stop it. Every morning, I'd wake up to the sound of machinery. Every evening, I'd watch another piece of my heritage disappear under concrete and rebar. The worst part was the workers. Most of them were local guys, people I'd grown up with, people whose families had lived in these mountains for generations. They wouldn't meet my eyes when I drove past the construction site. They knew what was happening wasn't right, but they needed the work. Sorry, Marcus. Tommy Garrett called out one day as his crew installed street signs. Orders are orders. Orders. As if stealing a man's birthright was just another job. By October, they'd finished the infrastructure and started on the homes. Not just any homes, these were monuments to excess. 4,000 square foot mountain retreats. For rich people from Denver and Colorado, Springs who wanted to play at being outdoorsmen on weekends. Each house came with a 3-car garage, professionally landscaped yards, and private docks for when they finished flooding the valley. The irony wasn't lost on me. These people were buying homes in the wilderness, specifically because it was wild and beautiful. But their very presence was destroying everything that made it special. Voice filled with bitter sarcasm. The Pinnacle Development marketing materials were something to behold. Glossy brochures with pictures of happy families, hiking through pristine mountain meadows, and fishing in crystal-clear alpine lakes. They called it Bear Creek Reserve, a gated community for discerning individuals who appreciate nature's finest offerings. Gated. They were going to put a gate across the road my great-grandfather had carved through these mountains with his bare hands. The houses sold faster than anyone expected. $1 million price tags didn't slow down buyers, who were fleeing overcrowded cities for their piece of mountain paradise. By spring, 28 of the 35 homes were sold, and construction crews were working overtime to finish before the first families moved in. I tried to go on with my life. Tend my horses, maintain what was left of my property, pretend that everything was normal. But every day the sounds of hammering and sawing reminded me of what I'd lost. Every night, I'd lie in bed listening to generators humming. Where once there had been only the sound of wind in the pines, voice becomes darker, more intense. The homeowners started arriving in early June. Expensive SUVs with Colorado plates, pulling boat trailers and ATVs. Families with golden retrievers and children who screamed when they saw a spider. People who bought houses in the mountains but were terrified of anything wilder than a suburban deer. The complaints started immediately. There are bears in the area, one woman told Sheriff Martinez. Actual bears. Walking right through our yard. The coyotes howl all night, complained another resident. How are we supposed to sleep? My favorite was the man who called the county to report that someone's horses are eating our landscaping. Those would be my horses, grazing on land that had been in my family for a century, before your house existed. But the real problem started when they filled the reservoir. Voice builds ominously. In August, Pinnacle completed their dam modifications and began flooding the valley. I watched from my kitchen window as the water slowly rose, swallowing the meadows, the old growth trees, the rock formations that had stood for millennia. It took 3 weeks to fill completely. 3 weeks of watching my childhood disappear under muddy water. When it was finished, they had their lake. A perfect artificial mirror reflecting expensive homes and manicured lawns. The marketing photos would be beautiful, but they'd made a mistake. Several mistakes, actually, though it would take me months to figure them all out. The first sign of trouble came in September, during the heavy rains. I was sitting on my porch when I heard a sound that made my blood freeze. The groan of stressed concrete and twisted metal. The new dam was shifting, settling under the weight of more water than it was designed to hold. I'd grown up around that original dam. I'd helped Dad maintain it, learned every bolt and beam and structural support. My great-grandfather had built it to last, with materials and craftsmanship you can't find anymore. But he'd built it for a small farm pond, not a 40-acre recreational lake. The Pinnacle engineers had raised the height of the dam, but hadn't properly reinforced the foundation. They'd used modern materials and computer calculations, but they didn't understand the unique geology of this particular valley. They didn't know about the underground springs that fed the creek, or the clay deposits that became unstable when saturated, or the frost line that went deeper than their environmental impact study had predicted.